I think tennis has a bit of a wildcard issue. And I don't mean the players who receive them and how they perform, because some perform very well, but I mean in its core concept, do we actually like the idea of a wildcard? The current method for the selection of wildcards, in my view, does not meet the levels of meritocracy that should be present in a professional and competitive sport. Ideally, with a draw of 128 players, which is really very small indeed, in the context of how many players there are in the rankings, it is surely desirable to know that all the players are there based on merit. That could mean recent form, or previous achievements, but it ought to mean a combination of both of those. The issue with these parameters is that they are not specific enough. I believe that even wildcards should not be wild in nature, they should be based on a system. I think a fixed criterion is needed that allows the selection of wildcards to be much less based on the decision of individuals, on a board or committee. In the interest of fairness, the selection process should have no favouritisable bias towards players of the host country either. Only 4 countries in the world have a Grand Slam held in them. This alone is a privilege in my opinion. I think it is extremely non-meritocratic for an additional benefit of a much higher chance of receiving a wildcard to be available. I would blend the wildcard and lucky loser system together. In other words, the tournament would comprise of X number of players who had achieved direct entry on ranking, Y number of players who had qualified by winning 3 matches prior to the main draw, and Z number of invited players, which would comprise some players who'd lost in qualifying, and some players who are unable to play in qualifying, but are worthy of playing for more legacy-based reasons. The invites would be exclusively for former champions of the tournament, who had not won through or played in qualifying, former major champions who had not won through or played in qualifying, and the highest ranked players who had lost in the last round of qualifying. There would be a minimum ranking requirement of 200. The system would use the rankings of the Monday prior to the event starting, 1 week before. This means that any points gained the last week before the tournament would not count. However, I don't foresee this being an issue as players playing these tournaments are presumably not playing in the qualifying stage. It would only theoretically be disappointing if a former major champion moved from outside to inside the top 200 in the last week. I would maintain the number of spots available as 8, and I would rename the system from wildcard to invite. As an example, let's look at the recent Wimbledon. Stan Wawrinka received a wildcard and would have also received an invite under my system, due to being inside the top 200 and being a former major champion. Aside from him, the other 7 slots would have been filled with the 7 highest ranked players that lost their final round of qualifying. If you watched Wimbledon, you might be thinking that my take on this is questionable. What about Grigor Dimitrov? What about Artur Ferry? You might use those players as case studies for the argument of keeping wildcards. I'd argue that this is nonsense. If you are saying, look, one of the wildcards made the semi-finals, I might sarcastically argue, why not fill the tournament with 128 wildcards? I think everyone would agree that a 128 wildcard tournament would be ridiculous and totally non-meritocratic. So why are 8 wildcards acceptable? The reality is, it's highly unlikely anything changes in the way I've described. Not least, there is a trading mechanism linked to the system called reciprocal wildcards, where the Slam host nations agree to provide wildcards to players from other host nations in exchange for their own players getting wildcards when they get to those other Slams. I.e., a French player gets a wildcard in New York, that means that an additional American player will get a wildcard when they get to Paris the next year. It also draws in a lot of fans if certain players get wildcards. I think of Serena at this most recent Wimbledon. The tournament has got to be pretty pleased that she was playing in the draw. However, her run quickly fell apart, her knee apparently picking up an injury after just 1 set. And I do wonder whether there was a young player that missed out on qualifying by just 1 match that ought to have been in the draw instead.